Welcome to Sisters in Crime Australia and Murder Monday, when authors talk about their crime craft. I'm Karina Kilmore, a debut crime writer, a journalist, and a national convener for Sisters in Crime. And we've been celebrating women's crime writing since 1991. Before I introduce Louise Candlish, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Louise, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, so glad you're here. Let me officially introduce you though. You have 15 novels under your belt, amazing achievement, including several crime mysteries and thrillers, which, not surprisingly, meets with very enthusiastic approval from our Sisters in Crime membership. You grew up in the Midlands, but have lived in London since studying at university. Your thriller, Our House, won the British Book Awards Crime and Thriller Book of the Year and was shortlisted for several other awards. It was a #1 bestseller in paperback, ebook and audiobook, and is soon to be a 4-part ITV drama produced by Red Planet Pictures. Another recent release, The Other Passenger, a Hitchcockian tale of adultery and double-crossing set among Thames River commuters, is also in development for the screen. And it's great to know, however, that as well as all your writing, you also squeeze in time for a few of your favourite things: coffee, TV, salted caramel, tennis, lasagna, old heavy metal, the Archers and white wine. Sounds like a lockdown fantasy.
That's so funny because I love the way tennis is the only sort of active one, but actually it's a while since I've played. So watching tennis. So everything's quite sedentary on my list, isn't it? Watching tennis while eating and drinking, basically.
Perfect. Before we get to the questions today, though, can you please give us the elevator pitch for your latest book, The Heights?
The Heights, okay. And I have not prepared this, and I don't think I've been ever asked to give it an elevator pitch before, but this is it. So it's The Heights, and I would say it's a twisty psychological thriller about revenge. In the first scene, the narrator Ellen sees someone. She's at a client meeting, and she sees someone out the window standing on a roof terrace of the building opposite, and she goes into a sort of horrific paralysis of shock because she recognizes this person, and as far as she was concerned, they'd been dead for 2 years. And the reason she knows this is that she's the one who killed him.
Oh.
So something has gone wrong, something has changed and altered, and is she losing her mind, or has this person that she had very good reason to think was dead, has he somehow survived that? So that's the opening scene, and then you go back in time a few years and you see how she met this man who's called Kieran, and how they basically became one another's nemesis.
What a great setup. Fantastic. Now I'm going to shuffle our cards, and then we'll get to the questions. These are all our most favourite questions from members. Right. How do you write about violence?
I don't actually have an awful lot of explicit violence in my books. There might be a murder or an accidental killing, but I would keep the description of that very understated and implicit, really, rather than graphic. Yeah. And I don't have a policy about it either. That's just instinctively how I would tackle that. And the same goes for sex, actually. I don't write graphic sex either. I think very physical elements you can leave to the imagination. And so that's just very naturally what I've always done.
Yeah. How much of you is in one of your characters?
Lots of me is in lots of my characters all the time, but in a sort of not necessarily in the little idiosyncrasies, but in the knee-jerk emotions. So Ellen in The Heights, it's not a spoiler to say that she is a very neurotic, overprotective parent of her son Lucas, who's at the heart of the family tragedy and revenge story. And I think that the way she responds to the situations in the book is the kind of thing that that would be my initial reaction. So I try and sort of capture and harness my initial emotions in a situation, which might be, very primitive, very fury, the desire to, physically hurt someone, or in the case of Ellen, to, have someone killed or kill them. And obviously, being a normal law-abiding person, I would then keep those emotions in check, as the vast majority of us would. But in a novel, I allow those knee-jerk emotions to become, to be acted on. So there's a lot of me in initial reactions and responses. There's usually a lot of my humor in the narrator, particularly if it's a first person narrator. I find it sort of impossible to eliminate my own voice. So then normally there'll be a version of my own voice. And Ellen is a first person narrator. But yeah, I think some of the sort of crazier elements will find their way into my characters. So the book's called The Heights, and it's a nod to Hitchcock and Vertigo. And in fact, Ellen suffers from a condition which I suffer from. So that's a huge part of me that's in her, and it's a form of fear of heights called high place phenomenon, which unlike vertigo, which is, that kind of classic feeling of dizziness or, movement, rotating, is more of an urge to jump. So, and you only get it when you're on a kind of open high place. So if you were on a cliff top, a ledge, a bridge with a kind of low barrier, the top of a lighthouse, all of those sorts of things where feasibly you could throw yourself off. So that's called high place phenomenon. She has this. So when she sees her, arch enemy, Kieran, on a roof terrace, I'm trying to automatically set up the idea that to confront him, she might have to face her greatest fear, which is these open high places. So yes, now that I talk about it, there seems to be quite a lot of me in my characters, but I think that's inevitable. I just can't imagine writing any other way. And even when I have multiple narrators, which doesn't happen very often, but in The Heights there are 2 narrators. And in fact, there's also a journalist, because we have extracts of a Sunday Times interview with Ellen. And all 3 of those voices will have a bit of me in them.
Fabulous. Oh, we've covered this. How do you write about sex? Off screen or off the page, I should say. Let's go on to the next one.
Yeah, there'll be a line or two. There'll be a line or two of, just giving the kind of character of the sex, the mood of it. But I would never, ever write move by move, who did what when and how long it took. I'd leave all of that to the reader's imagination.
How do you approach representing diverse communities?
Well, I haven't really approached diverse communities in my books. I think they reflect my local area, which is a kind of very well-heeled white neighborhood in South London. So I'm not suggesting there aren't any diverse characters in my books, but it would be in a colorblind way. Occasionally I might give someone an Asian name, and without drawing attention to the fact that they're Asian, just, that is the name of the detective or the name of the neighbor. And again, the readers can, I don't really describe people. And so maybe that's why I haven't really tackled, the whole idea of minorities in my fiction, because I don't really describe anyone. So you can make my characters diverse. And in fact, in the TV adaptation of Our House, there's quite a lot of diversity, which I think is great. And it's been done in a totally colorblind way.
Yeah.
So the characters aren't discussing their differences or similarities at all. They just are who they are.
Yeah. Great. What's the hardest thing about writing a crime book?
I think the hardest thing is constantly, as if you're writing book after book, and I'm, as you said at the beginning, I'm now on book 15. I think the hardest thing is continuing to come up with good ideas, really good, strong, central premises for the book. I think that's the hardest thing, and I don't even attempt to start until I know that I've got a really meaty idea at the heart of the book, because it's such a crowded market, and there are, you know, sort of thousands, if not tens of thousands of geniuses peddling their trade in this genre. And so I do make sure I've got a really, really strong central premise before I start, because you have to have that hook to sell the book. And I don't mean me personally selling it. I mean, you know, the publisher selling it to booksellers and retailers and getting those orders. And, you know, the stronger the concept at the heart of a crime novel, I think the easier it is to sell, and the more likely you are to intrigue readers who are spoiled for choice, not only on the page, but on screen. So that is hard. And sometimes I'll, you know, the idea won't come as quickly as I hoped, but so far it has come. And I hope they'll continue to come.
Do you start with plot or character or something else, leading straight onto it?
Straight on, perfect segging. I'll always start with a central idea. And I used to be an advertising copywriter. And so I have always found it very useful to write a blurb before I start. So I might try at first to write a shout line. So, you know, that one line you get on the front of the book, which in the Heights is, "It's time to confess what you did up there." But we probably have multiple lines like that over the course of the books coming to life. But then I'll write the kind of blurb you see on the, you know, the inner flap or the back of the book. And that will crystallize to me what the central idea is, and you know, the main theme. And only if I'm satisfied that that's strong enough will I then plot it out. And I'll do that usually by thinking about it for a long time and holding lots of ideas and obsessions in my head. Characters will probably be less important at that stage than the plotting and the mystery plot. And the crime itself and the kind of mechanics of the crime. And I'll usually write a full synopsis, actually, and I'll kind of create the plot as I write that synopsis. And, you know, later when the finished product is out, if you were to look at the synopsis, you would, you know, immediately spot that there are many differences. The character names will have changed. You know, perhaps a subplot has arrived that wasn't there in the synopsis. There may be some, you know, tweakings of the revelations and the whodunit elements, but generally, you know, there'll still be a good resemblance to my initial idea, because I have found that with crime plots, you know, you have to have it straight in your head before you start. Otherwise, you do waste quite a lot of time, because you have to, if things don't work out, then you have to scrap an entire idea. Then you could have wasted months of hard work. So I like to be fairly organized, but it's loose. You know, there's always room for that, you know, light bulb moment halfway through where you think, oh, I know, actually, let's slightly restructure this. And then, you know, we've got a potential for an amazing twist. But that's quite rare for me. Usually I'll know in advance what the twists and revelations are. So yeah, I'm a loose planner, a loose plotter. I would never start with, you know, just the idea that I've just described to you with the woman seeing someone on a roof terrace who she thought was dead. I would never start there and then figure out what on earth happened as I went. I need to know what the backstory is, fairly, you know, so fairly fully.
Okay. How important is place in your writing?
Place is, I think, one of the most important things in my writing, and probably would be for anyone writing a kind of noirish style of book, which The Heights is and The Other Passenger is, because, you know, that kind of the mood usually of the city, and, you know, even the kind of, you know, Ellen is a lighting designer, and that's kind of deliberate because, you know, the dark and and light, and you know, the shadows and dangerous corners of the city are quite important in the book, and indeed high places, as discussed. So very, very important. In this book, I revisit the River Thames, which is where The Other Passenger was set, for some of the book, because this is where Kieran lives. This is where Ellen sees her enemy in the first scene, and he lives in Shad Thames, which, for those who don't know, is a riverside area near Tower Bridge. And it's where all of the, or a lot of the trading used to take place centuries ago. So it's wharves and warehouses and inlets and those amazing sort of walkways between buildings. And they're all now expensive flats. There's no, you know, sort of spices being stored in these buildings now, only, you know, rich people who walk across Tower Bridge to the city. And so this is where Kieran lives. And yeah, I spent quite a lot of time there, just sort of drenching myself in the atmosphere, which is not hard because it's such an atmospheric area. And then I wanted to contrast that with where Ellen lives with her family. And, you know, following a family tragedy is gradually allowing the light back into her life. And she lives in a beautiful suburban home with a, you know, stunning garden, and a park nearby, and everything's sunlit and suburban. And, you know, there's hydrangeas and roses. And you know, I wanted to contrast that with this world she finds herself in when she's, you know, to all intents and purposes, stalking Kieran around these, you know, narrow cobbled streets of Shad Thames. So setting is, you know, would be one of the top three things, and it, you know, it's closely linked to mood. And I always say mood is the most important thing for me, mood and voice.
Fabulous. Sounds like a great contrast. Why is crime so appealing as a genre?
Well, I'd love to know what, you know, sort of how academics would answer that question. As a sort of amateur psychologist, I think that we enjoy the sense of order being imposed on chaos and then having that resolved. Generally, you know, the culprit will be apprehended and punished. That's not always the case, and it's certainly not the case with me, because I do like a sort of moral ambiguity. But generally in crime, I think you're going to have an investigation, whether it's a police investigation or a, you know, the character's own emotional investigation, and that's going to be resolved. And we don't always get that sense of resolution in real life, so it's hugely therapeutic to get it in fiction. So I guess that's the main thing. The other thing, and I touched on it a little bit by saying that I try and use my own knee-jerk emotions in my characters and then let them run wild in a way that I wouldn't. And I think there's that element as well. It's sort of the characters doing these crazy things and making mistakes and bad choices so that we don't have to. So we get to explore what would happen if we did let rip with certain responses. So I think it's therapy, and it's you know, that lovely sense of justice and resolution, and also sheer entertainment. I mean, it's fantastic. I love reading and watching very dark things and getting inside a, you know, a dysfunctional brain and seeing what happens.
Yeah, agree. What's your top writing tip, and what's your top self-editing tip?
My top writing tip, I think, is, again, I've probably already covered it in terms of you must have a really, really strong central idea. It's not going to be possible to find an original crime always. And, you know, I was lucky enough to do that with Our House when I think it was the first book involving the theft of a house. But since then, you know, I haven't included any crime that hasn't been written about before by other writers, but that's fine. But you do need to try and find an original angle. So some semblance of originality. So, you know, it's that famous thing that they say agents like, the same thing but different. So we recognize the horror of the original crime, be it murder or theft or fraud or whatever. But your angle into it needs to have some kind of aspect that's new and fresh. I think. So definitely the central idea. In terms of self-editing, easily the best gift you can give yourself is something that's really hard, which is time away from the story. So if you've finished your first draft, or depending on how you write, I personally sort of try and bang out quite a loose first draft almost, to reassure myself that the shape is right and the plotting works. And then the best thing you can do, I think, is have time away. Even a month or two would be a dream. So if, like me, you've got several books in your backlist and you might have different duties for each one. So at the moment, I'm promoting The Other Passenger in some markets, and The Heights in others. And there's the TV show, and I'm also writing my next book. So there's plenty of things that allow me to plan my schedule so I can take about 2 weeks or a month away from the book I'm writing. And then when you go back to it, you've forgotten enough to be a kind of fresh pair of eyes. And the difference that makes to editing is and rewriting is extraordinary. Whereas if you just take the weekend off and on the Monday you start reading or editing what you'd finished on the Friday, you haven't got the distance. So if it's a luxury, I know, because a lot of people will have either a self-imposed or a contractually imposed deadline that's hard to escape. But if you can plan your work so that you can take time away from a book between drafts, I think that's the best gift you can give yourself.
I love that idea of being your own set of fresh eyes.
That's because really... it's so hard. Yeah, and I think lots of writers will say, "Oh, I can't see the wood for the trees now, so I'm going to hand it over to my editor." But of course, if you're just starting out, you don't have an editor, you don't have an agent. You've got to take that role yourself, unless you know someone who you trust to do that. So time away from it, even though you're probably impatient to get going and to be, seeking the agent and the book deal. It might be worth taking that time in the short term for a gain in the long term, because you really will produce a better book if you have time away from it.
Great. Do women write different crime stories to men?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so at all. I'm writing psychological thrillers rather than procedurals, but in every aspect of crime fiction, I see brilliant writers of both sexes. No, I think that what you can find is that writers like me have come from a slightly different background in writing. So we might have arrived at crime fiction or thrillers via more emotional books. And that's certainly what happened with me. So some of my earlier books I would call emotional dramas, domestic dramas, where I've gone, deep into the psychology of the characters, but there's nothing criminal about their activities. They're making mistakes, but they haven't fallen into crime. So I think that, and someone like Lisa Jewell would be another example of that, where we began with family psychology and moved into crime and thriller. And I think that we do bring that kind of rich understanding of character, particularly female character. And I think that can be really rewarding for the writer. But that doesn't mean that someone who, started off straight away with a crime book can't do that. I mean, psychology is at the heart of all crime fiction, I think. And whether you're a man or a woman, you've got to explore that, or it's just not going to be compelling.
Great. What's the scariest thing in your new novel?
The scariest thing is, I think, this fear of heights, because anyone who has a phobia will know how frightening that is, whether it's claustrophobia or, fear of spiders or whatever, and in this case, fear of heights, because you really do, you're on the verge of panic, if not actually having a panic attack. And I think panic is possibly the most frightening thing for humans, because we know it then kind of paralyzes us and sort of destabilizes us, and we can't preserve ourselves, we can't rescue ourselves from a dangerous situation if we're paralyzed. So And as I said, I share this particular fear of heights, and so I knew exactly how to describe it. But it basically means you lose control of your mind and you lose control of your rational sense. And that's really scary, because once you've lost control of your good judgment, anything could happen. And so, not to give away plot points, but Ellen, anytime Ellen finds herself in a high place, she isn't acting the way she should. I mean, there's plenty of times when she's on ground level where she's not acting the way she should either, but it's particularly bad when she's up on high. I can feel my voice getting really gravelly because it's early in the morning here. So I hope you don't mind if I just take a slurp of coffee.
Absolutely, go ahead. Morning coffee is very important.
Oh my gosh, it is. And mentioned in my biography, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Oh, how many drafts do you do before you hand in your manuscript?
Well, I mean, they're sort of not complete drafts, but I would certainly have if we say printing it out in full, reading it, and then editing it and reading it again, I might do that 4 times before I hand it in. And then once it's in the hands of my agent and editors, it will probably come back a further 3 times with edits and corrections. With a really complicated book like Our House, which was structurally complex and also a very intricate crime at the heart of it, that probably had 8 drafts. But the Heights probably had about 5 drafts. Yeah, you have to be prepared to write and rewrite and write and just force yourself into that mode of imagining how it is to read it for the first time. I think that's the hardest thing, and that's why we need these amazing editors, because they have that ability. Even if they're reading it for the 4th or 5th time, they have that ability to be a new reader's brain and imagine at what point they might get bored, or at what questions they might ask, or what might be irritating, what might be rewarding. They just they'd experienced at that. So I always breathe a sigh of relief when I hand the book in to my editors for the first time, because I know I'm in safe hands then, and it's not just me at that point. It's a true collaboration, and it should be fine.
And I'm interested, you said you print off the manuscript and you read a physical copy. That's
Yeah. I mean, I do read it on screen as well, so I haven't included that in as a true draft. I know a lot of writers will print each draft in a different color paper, which I think is a really good tip. Donna Tartt does that, so that when you're editing and reworking, you know immediately which draft you need to go to. But I'm a bit more ruthless. Once I finished with a draft, I'll get rid of it. I prefer my brain to feel like it has a clean slate with each new draft. So I don't keep a collection of all of those printed manuscripts at all. I like that. It's a bit like sort of cleaning up before you start working, tidying your desk. So I don't have piles of pink, yellow, and orange manuscripts in my room.
What started you on a life of crime?
That's such a brilliant question. Well, I really did have a mini life of crime when I was young. I was like a sort of borderline juvenile delinquent, actually, in my feral childhood. But I didn't, I wasn't ever really in trouble. But I've always, from a very young age, been aware of the sort of, the dark side of me, and I've assumed others have it as well. So I think instinctively I've always going to be susceptible to dark stories. But in terms of reading and writing, I think an early passion for Agatha Christie needs to be mentioned, because she was following sort of childhood favorites. She was the first writer writing about adult situations that I completely fell in love with, and probably across the course of a year read all of her books, all 90 of them, and just I think that changed everything. And in fact, I do remember reading Death on the Nile, which was the first Agatha Christie I read, and it was just it felt like such a sophisticated world. And at that time I hadn't ever traveled anywhere. I lived in this, sort of unglamorous Midlands town in England, and I don't think I'd ever left the country yet when I read Death on the Nile. And this idea of Egypt and all of these people with their different agendas, and there's alcoholics, and there's adulterers, and there's thieves, and then of course there's murderers, and there's plotters, and they're against this exotic backdrop. I think right in that moment, that first crime novel I read, I think that it sowed the seeds of the things that I'm doing now, because I do like that combination of very bleak behavior but with a glamorous backdrop, good-looking people and living in beautiful houses. Or in the case of The Other Passenger, it's set on the river, and the commuters who commute by riverboat, and that whole idea of all of the riverside gloss, where the buildings are so stunning and reflective and glamorous, but behind them there's all manner of human crimes and misdemeanors taking place. And so I think that came right from my love of Agatha Christie, the exotic settings, and the difference between the surface and what's beneath it.
Yeah, perfect description. And our last question for today: how would you get away with murder?
I just absolutely, I could feel my palms sweating at the thought of blundering into it, because I could only ever blunder into it. I would never plot a murder, and I just don't think I would have that in me. I don't think you can now. I don't think it's possible in 2021 to get away with murder, because of all of the surveillance, our phones tracking us. London in particular, if I attempted it in London, it would be a disaster, because we're one of the, we've got the most CCTV cameras of anywhere outside of China. I don't think you can walk down the block without having your movements clocked by someone. So I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could get away with it. I think I would do what is the right thing to do when faced with a crime, and report it immediately, because that saves you a lot of trouble. And they do say the moment you start to cover up what you've done, particularly if it's accidental, and I've covered this in our house, if you accidentally cause mayhem, far better to come clean and cooperate than to cover up, because one element of the cover up will lead to the next and the next and the next, and before you know it, you really do have that classic web of lies, and you can't keep track of them. You don't know who you've told what, and the police will get you anyway. So yeah, I don't think I could get away with it.
No murder for you.
Best not to do it in the first place.
Yeah. I'm pleased actually, Louise. Thank you very much for being with us today on Murder Monday for Sisters in Crime Australia.
Thank you so much for having me, and for such amazing questions.